All right, good afternoon slash evening to everybody. Peter Marzano back with another album review as promised. I know I made a video earlier today discussing the shooting death of XXXTentacion that happened yesterday, talking a little bit about separating art from the artist. I will try to put a link to that in the description if you want to hear my thoughts on that. But today, as far as album reviews go, I'll be taking a look at Hybrid Theory, the debut album by Linkin Park, the LA-based nu metal band that exploded onto the scene in the music scene in general with this album in 2000. It actually became the best-selling record of the decade and had a few hits that were certainly really big in the mainstream. It was one of the more successful albums of the new millennium in general and certainly had a lot of influence. And as a white kid that grew up in the suburbs, it was certainly something that I listened to growing up, which also always, I should say, makes it interesting to listen to in retrospect at this point in time in my life. So I get started on basically my thoughts of the album, which opens with the song Papercut. Very energetic opener for the album, and I think ended up being one of the stronger tracks on the album in general. But it sets a general format for a lot of the tracks for the rest of the album, which I'm kind of going to call the Linkin Park formula, which was not only seen on this album, but is also seen on the album they released after this in 2003, Meteora. There's a lot of very formulaic songs that are included on the two albums. I will probably do a review for Meteora sometime down the road. But I do enjoy the track Papercut. There's very strong verses from Mike Shinoda. There's this very aggressive chorus by Chester Bennington. Rest in peace, by the way. It's almost been a year since he passed, succumbing to depression, and that is certainly a big theme on this album. And even though this album was released 17 years prior to his death, you could see that that was not a new struggle for the late vocalist. And I'll talk about that a little bit more with songs that are more relevant to that. But I did really like the song Papercut. Like I said, a lot of two strong verses from Mike Shinoda, very aggressive bridge. And that's kind of the formula that they initiate to use for the rest of the album. It has that, quiet verse, loud chorus, quiet verse, loud bridge, louder chorus. And you see that multiple times on the album. I think it really fits the thematic matter of Papercut quite well, and it definitely opens up the album in an engaging fashion that makes you want to listen to it more, especially because the song is really catchy, which is something in the genre of nu metal and rap metal up until that point wasn't really seen on any sort of level, and Linkin Park did it almost seamlessly starting off this album. That's followed by One Step Closer, which was a single off of the album. It was actually the first single released from the album. There's a bit of a cringy bridge in the song, the screaming of "shut up when I'm talking to you" repeated over the turntable scratches. I can't really get past that without kind of cringing, and it's a bit of a memey part, admittedly, but it does follow that same kind of format, and that's what you really start to see for the rest of the album. I do think that the track features one of the catchier hooks on the record, though, and I think that that's definitely one of the redeeming qualities. And up until that point, with those first two songs, while I don't think neither of them are great by any means, it certainly didn't make me want to turn off the album either now or when I was first listening to it, however long ago that was. That's followed by the track With You, which I think is definitely more climactic than the first two tracks. It starts off with the turntable scratches. It's a bit more atmospheric and spacey during the verses instead of, the heavy rock instrumentation that you hear in the first two tracks. It's also the first time Mike Shinoda appears in the chorus, and I actually think that those are the tracks that Linkin Park does the best on in this album, is when you hear Bennington and Shinoda splitting time in the verses and the choruses. It keeps you more engaged. I also think it contributes to the song sounding more catchy, and there's a really cool turntable breakdown in the bridge that I also enjoyed as well. And up until that point, it was probably the track that I enjoyed the most on the album. And the following track, Points of Authority, I'd even venture to say I enjoyed even more, and I think is one of the album's stronger tracks for sure. And while it's lyrically similar to the tracks that came before that, where a lot of this is, talking about the themes of depression and angst and anger, and you see a little bit more of that here with the chorus screaming, you like to think you're never wrong. I think it's a very well performed chorus. I think Mike Shinoda's verse, which actually begins the song in this case, and then there's a louder reprise of the verse during the bridge. I like that there's a little bit of that change within the format, that there's not as formulaic of a bridge right there. So that's the first time that they kind of venture off from that, and I think it pays dividends there. And I think it's definitely one of the stronger tracks, and one that is aged better than a lot of the tracks that you hear on this album. And that one, Like With You, was not released as a single, and I think it's actually one that probably could have done okay commercially, outside of just the fan base that they had listening to it regardless. The following track, Crawling, was definitely one of the band's most popular songs at the period of time. It's not really one of my favorites on the album. It's like One Step Closer, one that pretty much exclusively features Chester Bennington vocally. But I do think that the track has a lot of redeeming qualities, in the sense that this is the first track that really delves into Chester Bennington's history of depression and addiction, which was a big part of his life going into the release of this album. And of course, that unfortunately for him persisted throughout the remainder of his life. But I also think that during the chorus, while I can't personally really put up with the crawling in my skin, it is the most emotional he sounds on the album up until that point. And I think that that is really the first track on the album where you see the emotional and mental sincerity that is with Chester Bennington, not just on this album and on this track, but that you see throughout the rest of Linkin Park's career. And I think whether or not he continued to release good music, which I don't think that Linkin Park did for the remainder of their career for the most part, I think that you really see that pain in his voice, and that's something that I definitely think is worth mentioning. And I don't think it's a bad track at all. I do think it was the weakest track on the album up until that point. And unfortunately, from that point on to the next couple of songs, it does kind of hit a weak middle ground, which on a 37-minute album is something that you really don't want to see. And I really do think that this album, for the most part, is pretty airtight. I don't really think that any of these tracks are filler tracks per se. I just think that they could have been executed quite a bit better. Runaway is a track that immediately follows Crawling, and it's conceptually very similar. It's just quite a bit softer. It's more upbeat through the verses as well, describing a yearning for escape and kind of wanting a different life. And it can be interpreted in a number of different ways, of course, in the context of a relationship as well. And there's also this huge buildup, this vocal buildup to the final chorus, which is very similar to One Step Closer, and those two songs are quite similar in that regard as well. So that's probably the first song in the album that I didn't really enjoy at all per se, and that's followed by Myself, which I actually think is the weakest track on the album. And I also think that on this track, the lyrical subject matter, I get it, it's kind of like this introverted anthem, but I think that the subject matter would have fit better with the softer instrumentation that you kind of saw in Runaway. But there's this highly aggressive tone that's taken in the track instead. It's probably the heaviest song on the album overall. And while I think Chester Bennington's vocal performance in the song is among the strongest that you have on the album, especially during the bridge as well, I just think that thematically it would have worked better with different instrumentation, and that it didn't really fit with the music there. Fortunately, I think the rest of the album, for the most part, is very strong. That's immediately followed by In the End, which ended up being the group's most successful single overall. And I think it's one of the album's strongest tracks as well. There was a huge pop impact. The song was huge, and it was really what put Linkin Park on the map, exploring ideas of frustration, not getting what one feels is deserved. And that's another track that's kind of up to interpretation. A lot of people interpret it with it being the idea of a relationship and putting a lot in and not getting a lot out of it. But I think here, that Linkin Park formula that you saw earlier on in the album and on most of the tracks up until that point, I think this is a song where it actually fits the best, where you have the softer verse. It kind of returns to that spacey instrumentation that you saw a little bit on With You. And then there's a chorus that isn't too hard to make it avoid getting radio play, but at the same time, something that shows the aggression, that shows the passion that Bennington brings in his voice. And I really did enjoy that track, and I think that formulaically it worked out very well as well. I think the following track, A Place for My Head, is my personal favorite on the album. I think it is the best production and instrumentation on the album. It's very hard hitting, very brash, very aggressive, and I think it's all thematically appropriate because this is a song to where he is perhaps most explicitly talking about being in one's head and really not knowing what to do with oneself or not knowing how to make sense of one's thoughts. And that is really something as an overarching theme on the album in general. But I think in this song where he really delves into the concept, it works really well. I think the closing sequence is very well with the bridge starting off very quiet and Chester almost whispering into the microphone before screaming perhaps the loudest that he did throughout the entire album. And it's the first song that actually differs from that formula quite a bit. And I think it really works. I think Mike Shinoda is incredibly strong on the track as well. And it really hits hard. And I think to this day, it's a song that aged quite well, especially when considering that it is quite explicitly a rap metal song and worked very well in that regard. The following track, Forgotten, I also think is incredibly strong in relation to the rest of the album. Shinoda and Bennington split the chorus on this one. It returns to that atmospheric instrumentation in the verses. There's a very, very catchy hook. I think the catchiest on the entire record. And also Chester sounds very emotional and convincing on the song, just as he did on Crawling. I think this one's a better track. And I think also splitting the bridge gives the track more energy and more great build up into the final chorus. And to me, that is Linkin Park playing to its strengths. And you only see that on probably half of this album, and you see a little bit more on their following album. But I think that that's something that if that was more consistent throughout the rest of the album, if their formula included kind of Chester and Mike building off of each other a bit more instead of splitting with Mike having verses that for the most part were really good on this album. But I really think they feed off of each other and give the tracks more energy when they're splitting time in the verses and the choruses. The following track, Cure for the Itch, I also really enjoyed. It's an instrumental track exclusively performed by Joe Hahn, who was the band's DJ, called Cure for the Itch, as that is describing a scratch, as he is scratching the turntables on this one. It starts off with a lot of turntable scratching and then makes an announcement saying he was going to change things up a little bit in the track. And then I really like the second part of the track, which is very instrumentally different from the earlier parts of the album, starts to show a bit more versatility, and I think also is maybe a bit of a preview for what you see instrumentally on their following album, Meteora. I think you start to see a bit more of those sounds on their next album, whereas this album was perhaps a bit more aggressive and more hard-hitting than Meteora instrumentally. But I definitely enjoyed Cure for the Itch. I actually enjoyed it more than the instrumental track that was on the succeeding album. I do think it's one of the stronger tracks on the record. And then he follows that up with Pushing Me Away, the closer. And I think this track is, once again, one that I didn't really enjoy that much in comparison to the rest of the album. I actually think that it almost would have been better to swap Pushing Me Away and Cure for the Itch in the album order. Obviously, this album doesn't really have a cohesive concept and doesn't follow anything like that. But I think at the end of the day, it would have given the album better closure if this song was placed either before Cure for the Itch or even earlier in the album, where it fits thematically more. Because I did find that the second half of the album took on a slightly different tone than the first half, at least instrumentally. There was a bit more, a bit more instrumental versatility, a bit more emotion on the second half of the album. And I think that this perhaps would have fit better on the first half of the album. But I think either way that it didn't really have a dramatic impact on how I consumed the album or how I thought of it, because there wasn't really a cohesive concept to follow along with, which is not anything to really expect from the band. That of course, is not a reason to knock the album at all. But overall, I think, 18 years after its release and probably, 14 to 15 years after I listened to it for the first time, I still very much so enjoy this album. I don't personally enjoy it a ton, but I enjoy it a lot, especially when taking the context of what this album meant to the genre and getting an album like this to really break into the mainstream, because we haven't seen anything like it since. And in that sense, it's hard to kind of think about it now, 18 years later, where music is just so completely different. And that ultimately this album didn't have a lasting impact on having the genre penetrate into the mainstream entirely. But I think still at this period of time, Linkin Park did something that was incredibly unique, incredibly impressive, taking a genre that was very niche and had listeners that were, very laser focused in on a few artists, and being able to really expand that, kind of building off of the momentum that Limp Bizkit set with Significant Other that was released a year prior to that. I think this album kind of took a bit of that momentum and just really expanded on it and made music that was, quite frankly, just a lot more easier to listen to. And for that reason, I enjoyed the album and do think that this album is extremely significant in music, because I don't know how many more times we're going to have a rap metal album like this get into the mainstream, go 10 times platinum, become the best-selling album of the decade. It's really unheard of. And I think in retrospect, that's really something to acknowledge and appreciate, even when looking at Linkin Park's later material that was stylistically, thematically, and lyrically very different from Hybrid Theory for the most part. I mean, of course, Meteora was kind of an extension of it, but was not nearly as successful. And the music that they made succeeding Meteora was very much so stylistically different than their first two albums. So for those reasons, I really did enjoy the album, and find looking back on it and listening to it still makes me feel really impressed that something like that was able to happen at that point in time in 2000, when if you look at the other genres that were big at the time, you're looking at the teen pop explosion, you're looking at Eminem getting onto the scene, where hip hop and bubblegum pop were really the dominant forces in music at the period of time. This was something that was unheard of, and it turned into the biggest smash hit possible. And I don't think that the commercial success makes the album great explicitly, but I really do think that this album was commercially successful because a lot of the music on here was good and was easy to listen to. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. For this album, I give it a score of a 71 out of 100. I really enjoyed it for the most part. I did think that a lot more could have been done. There could have been more experimentation, but they played to their strengths. They followed the format. It was an airtight album. There were no fillers. There were tracks where more could have been done, but overall, they delivered on pretty much everything that they were trying to. And for that reason, I really enjoyed it. So thank you for tuning into this album review. It's been Peter Marzano. Should be back with some more. I don't work tomorrow, so I'll probably have another one of tomorrow of some sort. But thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you later.